Welcome to Uriah Heep, the Magician's Podcast. I'll be covering every studio song the band has recorded and every bonus track that I can find. Each week we'll go over a new song from the beginning to where they are currently, and as they keep adding albums, I'll keep adding shows. Let the deep dive party begin.
In the magic garden, some were singing, some were dancing.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Uriah Heep, the Magician's Podcast. I have a co-host this weekend. We are joined by Brandon from Metallicast. Brandon, how are you doing?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. Was that energetic enough? Do I sound like I'm excited that you're here?
You sound excited, and I want to believe that you are actually excited and not just putting on a show for me.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, anyway. So you run. So
do I sound excited or do I sound dead inside?
No,
I do?
You're like 3 decibels higher than you normally are.
Okay.
So I feel good.
I could be more excited if you want me to.
Maybe when the song starts. Yeah, we'll see.
Okay. All right. We'll see how it goes.
Sure. So you run Metallicast, which if I understand and if I'm explaining this right, let me know if I'm not. It's basically a chronological history of Bill Bixby, who played the Incredible Hulk on the television show The Incredible Hulk, while the Incredible Hulk was actually played by Lou Ferrigno. So that doesn't even make sense. Is that a good assessment of your show?
I would say that's perfect. I'm a really big Lou Ferrigno fan, and it just led me to wanting to do a weekly podcast called Metallicast. The annoying part is that it attracts a lot of Metallica fans, and I say, no, this podcast is not for you. Please go away and find me fans of old school 1970s. Was it 70s or 80s?
I think
70s,
late
right?
70s going into the early 80s, probably.
Yeah, I should know this as the host of the Lou Ferrigno podcast. Yeah.
I think that you should have a podcast where you talk with Lou Ferrigno about Metallica songs.
I would love to do that. Hey, if Lou Ferrigno, if you are listening and you have no clue who Metallica is, if that's the case, I will be more than happy to have you on and talk to you about Metallica. I will explain to you who they are.
There you go. You know, I think he would be a fun guy to hang out with for a little bit.
I think so. Have you seen him on King of Queens?
I have.
He seems like a fun guy.
He does, yeah.
He seems like a fun guy. Yeah, I would like to have him as my neighbor.
I also saw him on The Apprentice, though, and I don't think that most people that were contestants on that show should have been there because it's just like not the right environment for them to be in.
Are you including Lou in that? Poor Lou?
Yeah.
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 That's too bad.
It's too cutthroat for somebody who's a nice guy, you know, and Lou seems to be like a really nice guy.
Yeah, he does seem like a generally nice guy.
Even if he can lift you over his head with basically one finger, I don't want to test that. Now, the truth about your podcast, though, is it has less to do with Bill Bixby and more to do with Metallica. What made you start the show?
I am just a massive Metallica fan. I have been since I was a child. I remember the first time I heard them, I was like in first grade. It was the Enter Sandman music video on MTV, and it captured me, captured my young infant brain, and it just led me on this journey that I really dove head first into once I was in middle school. And you know, I've said this on my show as only half jokingly. There's a lot of truth behind this, is that I can talk about Metallica forever, and I will talk to anybody, even if they do not want to listen to me. I will talk to them about Metallica. And it got to the point where I was turning every conversation with my wife into a Metallica conversation, to the point, and this is not a joke, she would say something and then look at me and say, okay, now tell me what Metallica is doing. So I said, you know what? Maybe I need an outlet for this. So I started this podcast, and I said to myself, oh, this is a unique idea. There's no other Metallica podcasts out there. I started a Twitter account, realized there's 3 or 4 Metallica podcasts out there at the time. Now there's like maybe 10 Metallica podcasts out there. But it really just became an outlet for me. And it was a lonely outlet at first. It was just me talking to myself about my favorite band. But over time, people strangely started listening, and it continued to, it started to grow. And I had other fans on the show, and then journalists and authors and bands and people who have personal and professional connections to Metallica themselves. So I've been lucky to have a lot of cool guests on the show. We've had a lot of interesting conversations, and it's a real passion of mine at this point.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I've been a fan of theirs since I was in the 9th grade. Was I think right around the time Master of Puppets came out. And I really kind of felt like I joined the game late because they already had, Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning out. And here I am joining them on a 3rd album when they've already been a mega successful band that magically I'd never heard of. I got really sick and tired of seeing jean jackets with their album covers painted on them. And I'm like, who are these people?
Yeah.
But once I checked them out, I was absolutely hooked. I did want to ask you, because you would probably know this, when on the first song on Ride the Lightning, Fight Fire with Fire, and then on Master of Puppets, Battery, Cliff Burton wrote those classical style intros, didn't he?
So I believe that actually it was James Hetfield, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay.
At least the Battery introduction, because I remember reading an interview where Kirk Hammett is telling the story of when they were sitting around, because at that point during those albums, they were all living in one house together in California. And I drove by the house and my Metallica tour I took out west. It's just your regular small suburban house now, but knowing the history of what was inside it, it was a great moment for me. But they all lived in this little house, party there, wrote all these classic albums. And I remember reading this interview where Kirk Hammett was explaining James Hetfield just sort of started playing it on an acoustic guitar that was lying around. And he was like, "What are you playing?" And then that turned into Battery. But Cliff Burton had a huge classical influence. And there are many moments and many musical themes that he brought into those first 3 albums that were rooted in his classical influence. And without Cliff Burton, I think that band would have been a lot less melodic and probably would not have ventured down those avenues to have those more classically tinged acoustic intros for songs like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I didn't realize that James wrote the intro to Battery. That's cool.
I'm pretty sure he did. I'm sure somebody will tell me I'm wrong, and maybe I am, but I'm only human.
Right. Yeah. Well, you can't know everything, or you weren't there. But that had to be a little surreal, going by that little tiny house and going, "This is where metal was born." Really? This, that? How is that possible?
Yeah, it was really cool. My wife and I, we flew out to, I'm on the East Coast. I'm born and raised in New England, and now I live right outside New York City. So we flew out to San Francisco, and then we ended up doing a road trip all the way up to Seattle. We went up the coast. But when I was in San Francisco, I said, I need to do a mini Metallica tour and just sort of see like the hot spots. So like I went by the house in El Cerrito, California. Went by there. I drove to San Rafael, which is a little bit north of San Francisco, where they have their current headquarters. It's just like a warehouse, and it's all barbed wire fence to keep people like me out. And it's on like this basically abandoned street in like the middle of nowhere. And I just stood out there for about 20 minutes staring at the building like a creep. But it is cool, though. You can see some spray painting drawings that James Hetfield did on the side of the building and stuff. So like, I did spots like that. And just in San Francisco in general, like you'd go into a random place and they'd have, an autographed picture of Metallica, because I'm sure somebody had performed there or eaten there or drank there or whatever the case may be. So it's just so much history. I made sure that I went to the song Battery that you mentioned is named after Battery, a street where an old club that they played at was on. So I went down went by where the club used to be and stuff. It's now, so many of those places now are gone and are something different, but you kind of have to like look at the picture on your phone of like what it was and then match it up with the building. Like, all right, well, somewhere in that space, history was made at some point,
Right,
but
yeah.
for a nerd like me, it was a really cool experience. And fortunately, my wife let me indulge myself in my nerdum.
Oh, sure. And it's fun too. I remember for Christmas one year, I got the VHS of Cliff 'Em All, that what was it, the
Oh, yeah.
14.99 video cassette or whatever. And
Yeah.
it's so interesting to see them singing like Seek and Destroy. James especially, he looks so young, he just looks like a
Yeah.
kid. And thinking about how they created something really new and fresh, and they've just made an empire of it. I mean, they're one of the most successful bands in history. And I love that they stuck to their guns. I love that they didn't let people tell them how they needed to write music. They just said, no, this is the way we do it. And they didn't, they didn't let themselves be turned by a record company executive or somebody saying, no, this is how you be successful in that. They just pushed and did it. I really love that.
Yeah, I agree. And a funny story is that, the Black Album, like I said, was new when I was in first grade. So because of my age, I came in later in their career. And I remember the first CD I ever owned was Load when I was in sixth grade. So it was not until after I owned the Black Album and Load that I realized they had other albums before that, and kind of did my homework and started educating myself. But I remember after Load, I bought Kill 'Em All. And I brought that home. I brought the CD home and I opened it up, and I had the opposite reaction to all the old school metalheads. Like, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master Puppets, that was their Metallica. And then Load came on, like, who are these people with the short hair and the mascara and doing? I had the opposite reaction where I'm like looking at the back cover of Load, where it's these short haired guys drinking the martinis, smoking the cigars, wearing these like designer suits, then open up the Kill 'Em All, where it's the long haired, pimply faced teenagers. I'm like, this is the same band.
Right. Well, it's like Kiss, you look at them with their makeup and the stage ghetto, and then you see them get up, and then you see them like what they did after that. And you're like, wow, it's not the same band.
Put the makeup back on, please.
Right, please. We don't need to see that. So you and I did something interesting here. We tried to find some connections between our two bands, Uriah Heep and Metallica. And we basically came up with the fact that they shared a bunch of magazines together, with articles in the same magazine at the same time, which is really not a real connection. I would imagine they had to have played a couple of festivals together at some point. But Lars Ulrich had mentioned that he felt Uriah Heep deserved to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And despite any feelings that anyone has about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and how silly it is kind of a cool thing for somebody who is in a very successful band to say, hey, I like these guys. I think that their work should be noted for everyone to see beyond what they've put out. Like, they deserve that recognition from an outside source. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. And, I have the same opinion of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where I feel like it means nothing if you are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But if you are in it, I think it's a nice recognition, a nice gesture from the music industry. And, Metallica is in. They got in. They were a first ballot band. They got in. So them being at their stature, I think now they have a responsibility to kind of be a spokesperson for the bands that should have been in a long time ago. Like Motorhead, Iron Maiden, Uriah Heep, like they now, I feel like they feel themselves that they have, and obviously I cannot put words in their mouth, but judging by interviews like this, they are sort of campaigning for all these bands that they are fans of, that influence them to be in, because let's be honest, all those bands should have been in years ago. But and that's the way it works, and I get some of it is just marketing. Like, they need a couple big artists each year to really, sell the TV show and to sell the tickets for the live show and whatever the case may be. And then they, always have to have a few smaller artists and whatnot. And I get not everybody can be in all at once, but still there's so many bands that should have been in forever ago that's not in. And that's a whole other debate. But I do think it is a cool recognition, even if it means not much. I feel that way basically about like every award. Like, you know, to win 10 Grammy Awards, that means nothing if you've never won a Grammy Award, but to win 10 Grammy Awards, I think that's a cool gesture from the music industry. And I think that's how Metallica views it too. You know, they never set out to be a Grammy Award winning rock and roll Hall of Fame band, but they appreciate those gestures. And I think most bands would.
Well, a Grammy doesn't sound very metal, does it? You know, like you're just how much more distortion can I get in this guitar sound? But then you're like, hey, we're going to go accept our Grammy. Like, it just sounds like such a Hollywood thing. The thing is that they were really the big forerunners in getting Deep Purple inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I think once they were listened to get a band who honestly should have been inducted on opening day, you know, I think Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple should have been like opening day. Here are the 4 bands that we're putting in here because these are the 4 pillars of rock and roll. That obviously didn't happen, but I think because Metallica really pushed so hard to get Deep Purple in there in the first place, now that they've accomplished that, they can go, okay, now people are paying attention to what we're saying. They're listening to us. Maybe we can help some of these other bands get in there because we feel they all deserve it. And they do. But I think the issue that I have really with the Hall of Fame is 2 things. One, the people that they let in are not necessarily people that have made huge impacts in the industry. It's kind of like, well, yeah, we know who you are, so you're in. We need some lesser known bands to kind of balance out the big one, like you were saying. And they're not really rock and roll musicians. And then the other thing would be just change the name. Just call it the Music Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And I would be a lot more open to anybody that's had success to be in there.
Yeah, I agree. I think at this point they need a rebranding to like the Popular Music Hall of Fame, because popular music, it, you know, is everything from jazz to hip hop and everything in between. And that's really what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is, you know, there's, you know, Run DMC's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You know, and I know there was some crossover and whatever, but I believe like John Coltrane is, and Miles Davis. And I'm not saying those musicians should not be it. I'm just saying it's a little misleading if you are taking the name literally as rock and roll, because rock and roll, I think of Chuck Berry, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, Metallica, the Doors, you know, Iron Maiden, all the bands that we've mentioned already.
Right.
That's what I consider rock and roll. And, you know, NWA, I think, is a great rap group, obviously very influential. They're not rock and roll, but they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So I agree with you. I think just a rebrand, rebrand.
Yeah. And I love that they picked some great artists though to induct and give that credit to. I mean, you know, I'd like to see Dizzy Gillespie, and I'm looking forward to Chick Corea getting inducted, and I'm sure that'll happen at some point. But yeah, just rebrand it, and then no one will be able to complain about who you put in there. You'll just say, hey, these are artists that deserve recognition, and then we'll be fine, you know. But I would like to, now the Uriah Heep did get in a European version of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I can't remember what it's called, but they were inducted, I think, a couple years ago. And it was really nice to see that, because again, it's that recognition. But to me as an artist, when you look at your record sales, or these days your Spotify plays that you're not really even buying a new car with, no matter how many you have, that is kind of the recognition, right? Like you see now they just hit, was it 40 million record sales is the peak that Uriah Heep just hit. 40 million record sales. Like, do you need somebody to give you an award to tell you that people like your stuff?
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, it is an accolade, but I think it's more like, it's more to the fans, I think, because the fans are the ones that need justification to say, hey, I like this band, and it's not just me alone in my basement listening to cassette tapes. It's like other people like them too. You know, validation is the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
It's the weird thing with metal fans sometimes too, is that like we want that validation, but then so many of them act like, oh, but that's not metal, you know?
Right. Yeah.
It's like, oh, you're performing on the Grammy Awards. That's not metal. Realistically, if you want me to watch the Grammy Awards, have Metallica perform and have other rock bands perform. That's what's going to make me personally watch, you know? Mm-hmm. But it's just that weird gray area, I guess. But everybody's going to complain about something, especially with the internet. So,
oh God, yeah, it's such a double-edged sword, that thing. But before we get into the song, since you mentioned performing at awards ceremonies, wasn't there, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not that up on the history, but wasn't there a performance that Metallica did at some big like MTV awards thing that they said these guys are never coming back? I don't know if they performed a song that was controversial, or there was a lot of language in it, or what it was. Wasn't there some event like that?
I think the story that you're thinking of is there was I think it was the
MTV European Video Music Awards.
Okay.
And Metallica was scheduled to perform. This was after Load came out. So they were scheduled to perform one or two tracks off Load. I'll say King Nothing. And instead of doing that, they came out and without any of the producers knowing, they did a cover of So What, which starts with so fucking what. And if you need to see the lyrics of the song, Google So What Metallica. The lyrics are going to pop up. They're very, it's a punk cover from a obscure band, the Anti-Nowhere League. The lyrics are very crude, very vulgar, a lot of profanity, a lot of sexual acts being done to various things, animals and whatnot. That's the kind of song it is. And then they followed it up, I believe, with Last Caress by the Misfits.
Oh, okay.
Which has, mm-hmm. the famous lines of, I'll kill your baby today, among other things. So yeah, they chose to do two kind of controversial punk covers instead of playing their song. As far as the fallout goes, I'm not sure there really was any, because I think Metallica's in this unique position where they're Metallica. They're, if MTV wants people to watch, they're one of those bands, at least during that era, that they would put on. Now MTV's something completely different. I have no clue what it is even anymore, but I'm officially too old to understand it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I was growing up when MTV first started, and that was, it changed the world. It really did. And now I don't know what it does. The other thing I just realized, though, that these two bands do have in common is that they have sustained through a lot of tragedy. They've sustained through people, with alcoholism, with drugs and all that. And both of them have just kept going in one form or another, and have really been able to continue to make good music, whether people like this version of the band or that version of the band, or this album or that album. Like, I know a lot of people kind of dropped off at Load and Reload for Metallica. But, to me, it's that bands are going to change. They're going to morph. They're going to learn from a tour. They're going to experiment. And if you don't like a version of the band, just wait and see what they do in the next album, but maybe go back and listen to that album in a few years and see if maybe you have a different opinion on it.
Yeah. And, listen, if a band has been around for, I'm going to say more than 5 years, chances are if they're a prolific band, they've done something that has not been your cup of tea. If they've been around for 10 years, 15, 20, 50 years, they're probably going to do several projects that are not your cup of tea. Some of them are going to age well. Some of them are going to maybe still suck at the end of the day. But, you listen to these bands for a reason, because the majority of their output is good to great. Mm-hmm. They're still putting on relevant, well-crafted performances on, so I think there are those albums that will age gracefully. There are other albums that are not. There are lineups that are going to always be somebody's favorite. People with Metallica saying the band died when Cliff Burton died. It's like, oh, so you're just going to ignore like whatever it was, the 20 years Jason Newsted was been. And now, actually, interesting fact is Rob Trujillo has officially been a member of Metallica longer than either Jason Newsted or Cliff Burton. So he's been their longest tenured bass player so far. So it's like, it's just a matter of opinion, and I respect everybody's opinion. And but I think you also, when you have these bands that have been around forever, you have new generations of fans with different entry points.
Right. Yeah.
And I know when I've had, just having other fans on the podcast with me, there are fans that are, I bought Kill 'Em All day one. I saw them in San Francisco in 1983 and whatever the case may be. And then I have a fan on the next episode. He's like, yeah, my first album was Death Magnetic in 2008. That's my all-time favorite Metallica album. It's just, I think a lot of it has to do with what your entry point is. I know for me personally, like I hold Load and Reload in higher regard than probably a lot of older school metalheads, because those albums were out when I was in middle school, and those were some of my first early experiences discovering this band. So for me, I have a different perspective on those albums, so I think that's a lot of it too, is just sort of the lineup or the album that you entered the band on.
Yeah. And it's the same for Heep. I mean, 24 albums, that's a lot of entry points for people. And over a 50-year career, for me, it was their fourth album that I heard first. And then I went back and did, but I had no idea of the next album I got. I didn't know where it was in the catalog. I just knew it was an album that band put out. I didn't even know who was on it. I just loved the album. And then, of course, over time, then I'm like, oh, okay, well, this was their second album. This was their fifth. And, you start putting it together. And then you see that progression of the band, how they changed as musicians, how the different members changed them. But I think everyone that has been in Metallica is just a top-notch musician. I mean, there's no doubt about the talent or creativity of any of those people. And I'm just glad that they're still at it through everything that they've been through. It's really amazing.
Me too. I agree. And I feel that way about, most bands that are still going after all these years, even if it's not a band that, it's necessarily that relevant to me. More like Aerosmith, for example, is a band that I grew up loving. They're not a band in 2021 that's relevant to me personally. I could not really care. I could kind of care less if they release something new. I don't really have any interest in buying a ticket to see them perform, but I'm happy that they're still out there doing it and getting it done. I respect that. I admire that. And really at the end of the day, I don't want them to go away. I don't have any interest in them going away. My whole life, they've been a band. I want them to continue being a band,
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like you're like, you know what, I used to like you and now I kind of don't care. So just stop. If you're doing things that people enjoy, keep doing them. As long as you're having fun, it shows in the music and it shows on stage, especially. Like when I saw Uriah Heep, both times I've seen them, you cannot wipe the smiles off those guys' faces while they're playing from the beginning of the show until they walk off stage. It's just a constant, you feel that they just love being there and performing. And that is a magic that I've not seen that much from most bands.
Yeah. So two things is I never really understood the people who say they went through a phase with a band. Mm-hmm. I get being into a band and kind of growing out of it. I get that. But I've never listened to an artist I fully have been like, oh, that was a phase. I would not that I necessarily revisit certain albums a lot maybe now, but I can go back to it and be like, at the very least, appreciate it from a nostalgic perspective. That album's still a part of my DNA. That band, even if it's a cheesy one-hit wonder, is still part of my DNA. I cannot ignore it or fight it or write it off as, oh, it was just a phase I went through in seventh grade,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's what jazz is for.
But another thing to your point, and now I had another great point, and now my brain has gone completely blank. What's the last thing that you said? Rejog my.
I don't know. I was talking about something.
This is going great. I've already brought the whole podcast.
Thanks for coming on the show, Brandon. I used to love doing it. And now it's just a shell of what it once was. No, I think we were just talking about Aerosmith and different phases of the bands and how people are kind of I really like this album and not that album. And I think the thing is I get that if you're somebody who just didn't like the 80s sound, then when those bands like Uriah Heep, and I'll get to that phase soon enough, there are some things that sound very 80s. All of a sudden the Hammond organ goes away. It's a lot more synthesizer. It really has an 80s rock and roll feel to it. And if you were to take that and then listen to The Magician's Birthday, it doesn't sound like the same band. That's where they were at the time. for
Right.
whatever reason or reasons that they were at that point. So if you don't like that album, you just don't listen to it, but you don't crucify the band over it.
Sure. And that's why I'm like, if you're a Saint Anger hater, just don't listen to that album. Go listen to Master of Puppets.
Right.
Go listen to any other album,
Yeah.
If it just is a personal preference.
Well, speaking of personal preferences, you picked today's song. Well, you didn't pick it for the band. Like, they released it long before you ever knew who they were. But you picked this song to be on, to be the show that you wanted to be on. What's magical about this song that you picked today's show?
Well, two things is that I'm going to piss off every Heep fan right now listening to this. I'm not overly familiar with Heep. They're a band that's always been around, I've known the name, I've heard, bits and pieces of, but I've never really been able to do like a deep dive just because I just have never taken that plunge. So when we were talking about coming on this podcast, I was like, all right, I'm a newbie. I'm getting my feet wet. They're a band that I want to do a deep dive in. And when this song came on my radar, there was a lot of things that reminded me actually of Metallica in a certain way.
Interesting. Well, if only there was a show that did a deep dive, like 4 songs a week that you could listen to and learn about the band.
I know, it's almost as if maybe that podcast should exist and I should listen to it.
I wish somebody would do it.
I can't do it. I'm preoccupied with my Incredible Hulk podcast.
That's true. Yeah. Well, you can't let Bill Bixby's legacy die.
Yeah.
That sad song that they always played at the end of every episode. There's a title for it. I can't think of what it is. It's like the Lonely Man or something like that. That little piano outro that they would play at the end of every episode. And I even remember as a kid, like, it just made me so sad for him. I just wanted to find out what street he was hitchhiking on and go give him a hug and a burger or something,
I feel like if that came out now, if that show was out now, hashtag Sad Hulk would be.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sad Affleck. We got to have Sad Hulk.
Yeah.
Sad Bruce Banner. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Uriah Heep, the Magician's Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, please consider going over to Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast outlet, leaving a rating or a review. Be sure to subscribe to make sure that you are notified when new episodes are available. Please be sure to share this podcast with your fellow Uriah Heep enthusiasts and anyone who you think would like Uriah Heep, which should be everyone. And if you are so inclined, please feel free to contribute to the Patreon account. And if you are not a Patreon subscriber, you can also pay through the PayPal link on the website listed in the show links below. I would also like to thank Uriah Heep for their very generous support of the show, and thank you guys for listening. We'll see you in the next episode. Happy days!